The lights in the gravitational pull were always dim at this time of night, and that was how the customers liked it. The bar sat in the middle of Nexus Station, like a heart-pumping life through metal veins, and tonight it was full of the usual crowd. Smoke from a dozen different worlds mixed in the air and created a haze that made everything look soft around the edges. The smell was not bad, but it was strange and made newcomers wrinkle their noses until they got used to it. Dae-hyun sat at the far end of the bar where the light was weakest and the noise was not so loud. His drink was half empty and had been that way for the last hour because he was not really drinking it. He was listening instead and watching the crowd through the mirror behind the bottles. His face was plain and weathered like old leather, and his clothes were the simple gray jumpsuit that cargo pilots wore on long hauls between stars. Nobody looked at him twice because there was nothing special to see. The bar counter was made from some kind of black stone that came from a world nobody could pronounce, and it was polished so smooth that it reflected the lights like dark water. Alien hands and claws and tentacles rested on its surface and left no marks because the stone was harder than most metals. Behind the counter stood Jae-won, who owned the place and had been mixing drinks for beings from 40 different worlds. For the past 20 years, his face was kind but tired, and his hands never stopped moving as he poured and mixed and cleaned glasses that came in shapes no human had ever imagined. The crowd tonight was bigger than usual because 3 trade ships had docked at the same time, and their crews were all trying to forget the long weeks in space between the stars. At a table near the center of the room sat Woo Jin, whose blue skin gleamed like metal in the dim light. He was a Kalari, and his people were known for being loud and proud, and tonight he was both. His voice carried over the general noise of the bar as he told anyone who would listen about the great victories of his race. Woo Jin gestured with his long arms as he spoke, and his words came out in the common tongue that all spacefaring races learned to speak. His accent was thick and made some sounds hard to understand, but his meaning was clear enough. He was talking about war and glory and the kind of battles that made songs and legends. The beings around his table leaned in to hear better because stories of war were always popular in places like this, where danger was just a hull breach away. Next to Woo Jin sat Byung-ho, whose body was made of living crystal that caught the light and threw it back in patterns that hurt to look at directly. He was a Zephyrian, and his people were old and wise and patient, but tonight he seemed eager to match the Kalari story for story. When Woo Jin paused to drink, Byung-ho spoke up in a voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. His words were careful and precise because his people did not waste language the way others did. The crystal being told of sieges that lasted decades and battles fought with weapons that could crack moons in half. His people had held a fortress world against an enemy that outnumbered them 1,000 to 1, and they had not given up until help came from across the galaxy. The other beings at the table made sounds of approval because everyone respected the Zephyrians for their stubborn courage. At another table closer to the wall sat Namsik, whose 6 arms moved constantly as he cleaned his weapons or adjusted his armor or simply flexed his muscles because sitting still was not in his nature. He was a Vraxi, and his people were born for war and lived for battle and died with honor when their time came. His skin was red like dried blood and covered with scars that told stories of fights he had won and enemies he had killed. When he heard the others talking about war, he laughed and the sound was like grinding metal. Namsik stood up, and his bulk blocked the light from the overhead fixtures as he began to tell his own tales. His voice was deep and rough like rocks falling down a mountain, and he spoke of battles in the void between stars where his clan had fought pirates and slavers and worse things that had no names. He described boarding actions where warriors fought, hand to hand in corridors so narrow that bodies piled up like cordwood, and the air was thick with blood and smoke. The crowd around him grew larger as more beings came to listen, because the Vraxi were famous for their stories, and none of them were ever boring. Other voices joined in as the night went on, and the drinks flowed freely. A Salian merchant named Boram spoke of trade wars that destroyed entire economies and left worlds empty of life. Her serpentine body coiled and uncoiled as she gestured, and her forked tongue tasted the air between words. She had seen battles fought with money instead of weapons, and they could be just as deadly as any other kind of war. Near the back of the room sat Yunji, whose insect features clicked and buzzed as she communicated with others of her kind through sounds that most beings could not hear. She was Klikari, and her people fought in swarms that could strip the flesh from a man in seconds or tear apart a starship with their bare claws. When she spoke in the common tongue, her voice was like static on a broken radio, but her words painted pictures of battles that made even the Vraxi warrior nod with respect. The stories grew bigger and more impressive as the night wore on, and each being tried to top the last with tales of greater destruction and more glorious victory. Numbers were thrown around like coins at a gambling table, and each story had more ships destroyed and more enemies killed and more impossible odds overcome. The bar filled with the sound of voices raised in competition and admiration, and the kind of camaraderie that only came from shared respect for the art of war. Through it all, Dae-hyun sat quietly at his place at the bar and listened and said nothing. His reflection in the mirror showed a face that gave nothing away, and eyes that seemed to be thinking about something far away. Jae-won refilled his glass without being asked, and the human nodded his thanks but did not speak. The other beings in the bar barely noticed him, because he was just another face in the crowd, and not a particularly interesting one at that. The noise grew louder as more stories were told and more drinks were consumed, and the air grew thicker with smoke and the heat of many different kinds of bodies. Outside the windows of the bar, the stars turned slowly as the station rotated, and somewhere in the distance, ships came and went, carrying cargo and passengers and news from other worlds. But inside, the gravitational pull, the only thing that mattered, was the next story and the next drink, and the warm feeling of being among others who understood the weight of history and the price of survival in a galaxy that was beautiful and terrible and vast beyond imagining. The stories had been going on for over an hour, and the competition was getting fierce when Boram noticed something that made her curious. Her serpentine head turned toward the human at the bar, and her yellow eyes studied him with the kind of attention that information brokers were famous for. She had been listening to all the tales of war and glory, and had been adding her own stories to the mix, but something about the quiet human made her pause and think. Boram was good at reading people because her business depended on knowing who had information and who was willing to sell it and who could be trusted to keep secrets. She had seen beings from every corner of the galaxy and could usually tell what they were thinking just by watching how they moved, or where they looked, or how they held their hands. But this human was different because he showed nothing at all. The Salian merchant unwound herself from her chair and moved across the floor with the fluid grace that her people were known for. Her scales caught the light and threw it back in. Patterns of green and gold, and her movement was so smooth that she seemed to flow like water rather than walk. The other beings in the bar barely noticed her passage because they were too busy with their own stories and arguments, but Dae-hyun saw her coming in the mirror, and his eyes flicked toward her for just a moment before returning to his drink. Boram coiled herself onto the stool next to the human, and her tail wrapped around the base to anchor her in place. Her head came level with his shoulder, and she could smell the scent of recycled air and metal, and something else that might have been fear, or might have been something deeper. She studied his profile for a moment and then spoke in a voice that was soft but carried clearly over the noise of the bar. The human turned to look at her, and his face was polite but guarded, like someone who had learned to be careful about what he said and to whom he said it. His eyes were brown and ordinary and held no special light, but there was something behind them that made Boram think of deep water or distant stars. She introduced herself, and he nodded and gave his name, and his voice was quiet and unremarkable, just like everything else about him. Boram gestured toward the crowd with one elegant hand, and her forked tongue tasted the air as she spoke about the stories that had been filling the bar all evening. She mentioned the great battles and the impressive victories, and the way each race seemed to have its own proud history of warfare and conquest. Her words were careful and diplomatic because she did not want to offend, but she was genuinely curious about what the humans might have to contribute to such a discussion. The conversation at the other tables was still going strong and getting louder as the beings tried to outdo each other with increasingly grand tales. Wu Jin was describing a battle where his people had destroyed an entire fleet with nothing but determination and superior tactics, while Byung-ho countered with stories of sieges that had lasted longer than most civilizations existed. Namsik laughed at both of them and told of boarding actions where warriors had fought with nothing but their bare hands and the will to survive. It was then that Wu Jin noticed the conversation at the bar, and his blue features lit up with the kind of mischief that came from too much drink and too much pride. He called out to Boram and asked what she was discussing with the human, and when she explained that she was curious about human military history, the entire bar began to pay attention. The noise level dropped as conversations stopped, and heads turned toward the quiet figure at the bar. Wu Jin stood up, and his movement was not entirely steady as he made his way over to where Dae-hyun sat. The Kalari trader was grinning with the confidence that came from having told the best stories all evening, and he clearly expected to add one more triumph to his collection. He leaned against the bar, and his voice carried that tone of friendly condescension that beings sometimes used when they thought they were being kind to someone less fortunate. The blue-skinned alien asked about human warfare in a way that made it clear he expected the answer to be amusing, rather than impressive. His words suggested that he thought humans might have had some small tribal conflicts or maybe disputes over territory that would be cute compared to the grand battles that real spacefaring races had fought. The other beings in the bar began to gather around because they sensed entertainment coming, and nothing was more fun than hearing about the quaint customs of primitive species. Byung-ho joined the group, and his crystal body chimed softly as he moved closer to get a better look at the human. His voice was diplomatic and carefully neutral as he added his own comments about how all species had to start somewhere, and there was no shame in having modest beginnings in the arts of war. His words were meant to be encouraging, but they carried the same assumption that human conflicts would be small and simple compared to what advanced civilizations could achieve. Namsik pushed through the crowd with his bulk and his 6 arms crossed over his massive chest as he looked down at the human with something that might have been amusement. The Vraxi warrior suggested that maybe humans had fought with primitive weapons, or had food fights or territorial disputes over water sources, and his voice carried the kind of humor that warriors used when they were trying not to be too cruel to someone they saw as harmless. The laughter that followed was good-natured rather than mean, but it was based on assumptions that made the aliens feel superior and sophisticated. They had heard stories all evening about battles involving thousands of ships and millions of warriors and weapons that could destroy planets, and now they expected to hear about conflicts that would seem tiny and primitive by comparison. The human at the bar was just another curiosity from a species that had barely learned to leave their home world. More beings gathered around as word spread through the bar that they were about to hear human war stories, and the anticipation was the kind that people felt when they expected to be entertained rather than impressed. Yoonji clicked her way over from her table, and her insect features showed what might have been curiosity or amusement. So Young drifted closer, in the way that energy beings moved, and her form flickered with colors that suggested interest or possibly boredom. Through all of this attention, Dae-hyun remained calm and still, and showed no sign of being bothered by the assumptions or the laughter or the condescending tone of the questions. He finished his drink slowly and set the glass down on the black stone of the bar with a soft click that somehow carried over all the noise in the room. His movements were deliberate and unhurried, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but clear enough for everyone to hear. The human asked if they really wanted to hear about human warfare, and there was something in the way he said it that made the laughter die down a little. His tone was not defensive or angry, but there was a quality to it that made some of the beings step back slightly without knowing why. Boram found herself leaning closer because her instincts told her that something important was about to happen, even though she could not say what it might be. The bar had grown quieter now as more beings realized that something was happening at the counter, and conversations stopped as attention focused on the small drama that was unfolding. The lights seemed dimmer and the smoke seemed thicker, and the air felt heavy with the kind of expectation that came before storms or battles or other events that changed everything that came after them. Dae-hyun looked around the circle of alien faces that surrounded him, and something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was not a happy smile, but rather the kind that people wore when they remembered something that was both terrible and amusing at the same time. He picked up his empty glass and turned it slowly in his hands, as if the movement helped him think about where to begin his story. The human spoke in the same quiet voice he had used all evening, but now every being in the bar was listening, and his words carried clearly through the sudden silence. He began by mentioning that humans had indeed had some disagreements among themselves, and that one of them had been called the Second World War, because it was the second time they had tried to settle their differences on a global scale. His tone was conversational, as if he were discussing the weather or the price of fuel rather than warfare. The numbers came out slowly and matter-of-factly as Dae-hyun described the scope of the conflict without any of the dramatic flourishes that the aliens had been using in their own stories. He mentioned that somewhere between 50 and 70 million human beings had died during the 6 years that the war lasted, and he said it the way someone might mention how many tons of cargo they had hauled on their last shipping run. The beings around him began to shift uncomfortably because those numbers were larger than anything they had heard that evening. Woo-jin was the first to speak up, and his blue skin had taken on a paler shade as he tried to process what he had just heard. The Kalari trader asked for clarification about the numbers because surely the human had made some kind of mistake in the translation or had confused millions with thousands. His voice was less confident than it had been earlier, and there was a note of uncertainty that had not been there when he was telling his own stories about glorious victories and tactical brilliance. But Dae-hyun shook his head and confirmed that he meant millions and that the number might have been even higher because record-keeping had been difficult during some parts of the war. He went on to describe battles that involved entire continents and armies that numbered in the millions of soldiers. He talked about cities that had been completely destroyed and populations that had been systematically murdered and industrial complexes that had been built for no other purpose than to kill people as efficiently as possible. The alien faces around him showed expressions that ranged from disbelief to horror as they tried to understand what they were hearing. These beings had been boasting about conflicts that involved hundreds or thousands of casualties, and now they were listening to descriptions of warfare that dwarfed anything in their own histories. Byung-ho made a sound like breaking glass as his crystal body resonated with some emotion that had no name in the common tongue. Namsik stepped forward and his 6 arms gestured as he tried to find words for what he was thinking. The Vraxi warrior said that such a level of destruction was impossible because no world could survive that kind of damage and no species could endure such losses without going extinct. His voice carried the authority of someone who understood warfare and knew its limits, and he spoke with the confidence of someone who had seen the worst that civilized beings could do to each other. Dae-hyun nodded as if he understood the confusion, and then mentioned that humans had indeed rebuilt their world after the war ended. He said it took about 20 years to repair most of the damage, and that they had learned some lessons from the experience, though not all the lessons they should have learned. His voice remained calm and factual as he described how his species had recovered from devastation that would have ended most civilizations. The human continued his story by mentioning something called the Cold War that had followed the hot one and had lasted for about 40 years. He described how the 2 major human powers had pointed enough nuclear weapons at each other to destroy their entire planet several times over, and had maintained this state of readiness for decades. The aliens listened with growing amazement, as he explained that these were not the planet-cracking weapons that advanced civilizations used for mining or construction, but actual weapons of war designed to kill populations and render worlds uninhabitable. So Young flickered with colors. That indicated confusion or disbelief as her energy form struggled to process the information she was hearing. The Luxari being asked about nuclear weapons and whether the human was talking about the kind of devices that were used to break apart dead planets for easier resource extraction. Her voice carried the hope that there had been some misunderstanding, because the alternative was too disturbing to contemplate. Dae-hyun confirmed that he was talking about weapons designed specifically for warfare and mentioned that at the peak of the Cold War, his species had possessed approximately 70,000 nuclear warheads with a combined destructive power that could have reduced Earth to a cloud of radioactive dust. He said this in the same tone he might have used to discuss engine specifications or cargo manifests, and the casual nature of his delivery made the information even more shocking. The bar had become completely silent now, except for the sound of atmospheric recyclers and the distant hum of the station's engines. Even the background conversations at other tables had stopped as word spread that something extraordinary was happening at the main bar. Beings who had been laughing and joking just minutes earlier now stared at the human with expressions that showed they were beginning to understand that their assumptions about his species had been completely wrong. Yunji made a series of clicking sounds that indicated extreme agitation as her insect brain tried to process the concept of a species that could destroy its own world but chose not to. Her mandibles worked silently as she struggled to find words in the common tongue that could express what she was thinking. The idea that any race would build such weapons and then show the restraint not to use them was almost beyond her comprehension. Boram coiled and uncoiled nervously as her information broker instincts told her that she was hearing something that would change how every being in the galaxy thought about humans. Her yellow eyes remained fixed on Dae-hyun as she tried to read his expression for any sign that he was exaggerating or lying, but his face showed nothing but the calm certainty of someone stating simple facts. The Salian merchant had dealt with liars and boasters for most of her adult life, and she could tell the difference between truth and fiction. Other beings in the crowd began to whisper among themselves in languages that the translation systems could not handle, and the air filled with the sound of confusion and disbelief. Some of them were trying to do calculations in their heads to figure out what kind of industrial capacity would be needed to build 70,000 nuclear weapons, while others were trying to understand how any species could survive having such destructive power available to them. The stories that had seemed so impressive earlier in the evening now felt small and insignificant compared to what they were hearing from the quiet human at the bar. Wars that had lasted months or years and involved thousands of casualties were nothing compared to conflicts that could kill millions and weapons that could sterilize entire worlds. The aliens who had been so proud of their military histories were beginning to realize that they were children playing with toys compared to what humans had accomplished in the art of destruction. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes as the beings around Dae-hyun tried to absorb what they had just heard. The humans seemed to take their shock as encouragement to continue, and he signaled to Jae-won for another drink before settling back on his stool as if he were just getting started. His movements were still calm and unhurried, and showed no sign that he understood the impact his words were having on his audience. Dae-hyun took a sip of his fresh drink and then mentioned casually that the conflicts he had described were not actually the longest wars that humans had fought. He said this as if it were an interesting footnote rather than another bombshell, and his tone remained conversational even as the aliens around him began to make sounds of distress or disbelief. The humans seemed genuinely unaware that each new piece of information was making his audience more uncomfortable. The cargo pilot began to tell them about something called the Reconquista, which he explained was a war that had lasted for 335 years. He described how various human kingdoms had fought to reclaim territory from other human kingdoms, and how the conflict had passed from generation to generation, like some kind of inheritance that nobody wanted, but nobody could refuse. His voice carried the same matter-of-fact tone as before, as if he were reading from a shipping manifest, rather than describing centuries of warfare. Junho was the first to react, and the Salian information broker nearly dropped her drink as she tried to process what she had just heard. Her serpentine body coiled tightly around her chair as she asked if the human had made some kind of error in his calculations, because surely no species could maintain active warfare for over 3 centuries. Her voice was higher than usual and carried a note of desperation as if she were hoping to find some flaw in the story that would make it less terrifying. But Dae-hyun confirmed his numbers and went on to explain how the war had worked in practice. He described families that had passed down hatred and the duty of revenge through 14 generations, and told how grandfathers would teach grandsons about battles that their own grandfathers had fought. The human explained that some bloodlines had been at war for so long that the original causes of the conflict had been forgotten, and all that remained was the tradition of fighting. The beings around him began to make sounds that indicated various forms of psychological distress as they tried to understand the concept of inherited warfare. Most galactic species fought for resources or territory or survival, and their conflicts ended when the immediate causes were resolved. The idea of maintaining active hostility for centuries based on nothing but tradition was alien to their way of thinking and violated their basic understanding of how rational beings behaved. Dae-hyun continued his explanation by mentioning that the Reconquista was not even the only example of such extended conflict in human history. He told them about the 100 Years' War, which had actually lasted for 116 years and had involved multiple generations of the same royal families killing each other over claims to territory and titles. His voice remained calm as he described how nations could remain enemies for longer than most galactic civilizations had existed. The human then mentioned something called the Crusades, which he described as a series of religious wars that had run on and off for about 200 years. He explained how different human groups had fought over access to locations that they considered sacred and how the conflicts had flared up repeatedly across multiple centuries whenever political conditions were right. The casual way he described religious warfare made several of the more peaceful species in the audience make sounds of horror. Hyojin spoke up from her position near the back of the crowd, and her fungoid features showed the kind of distress that her people felt when confronted with concepts that violated their basic philosophy of harmony and cooperation. The mycelian asked how any species could maintain such levels of hatred and aggression for so long without destroying itself completely. Her voice was soft and sad, as if she were mourning something that had been lost. Daehyun smiled at the question, and the expression was not entirely pleasant as he admitted that humans were exceptionally good at holding grudges. He explained that his species had nations and ethnic groups that were still angry about events that had happened before they had developed writing systems, and that some of their conflicts were older than recorded history. The humans said this, as if it were something to be proud of, rather than ashamed of. The cargo pilot went on to describe family feuds that had lasted for centuries, and tribal conflicts that had been passed down through oral tradition for so long that nobody remembered what had started them. He mentioned border disputes that had flared into open warfare every few decades for over 1,000 years, and ethnic hatreds that seemed to be built into the genetic memory of entire populations. His tone suggested that he found this persistence impressive rather than disturbing. More beings began to gather around the bar as word spread through the gravitational pull that something unprecedented was happening. Aliens who had been playing games or conducting business in the back rooms came forward to listen, and their faces showed the same expressions of disbelief and growing horror that the original audience displayed. The atmosphere in the bar had changed completely from one of friendly competition to something approaching fear. Il-sung stepped forward from the crowd, and her collective consciousness spoke through the single drone body with a voice that carried the weight of millions of minds working in perfect harmony. The Kalaktari asked how individual humans could maintain personal hatred for conflicts that had started before they were born and continued after they would die. The concept of inherited anger was so alien to their hive mind that they struggled to find words for it. Daehyun explained that humans were very good at teaching their children to hate the same things they hated, and that cultural memory could preserve grudges with remarkable accuracy across many generations. He described how entire populations could maintain detailed knowledge of ancient grievances and pass down the emotional weight of historical injustices along with the facts. The human made it sound like this was a normal and natural thing for any species to do. The beings around him were beginning to understand that they were not just hearing about human military capabilities, but about something much more fundamental and disturbing. This was not just a species that was good at warfare, but one that seemed to be psychologically designed for sustained conflict across time scales that dwarfed the attention spans of most galactic civilizations. The implications were starting to sink in, and the aliens did not like what they were beginning to realize. Namsik tried to find some way to make the information less threatening by suggesting that surely human civilization had evolved past such primitive behaviors when they reached space and began to encounter other species. His 6 arms gestured hopefully as he spoke because the alternative was too dangerous to contemplate. The Vraxi warrior was beginning to understand that his own people might not be the most dangerous fighters in the galaxy after all. But Daehyun just smiled again and shook his head as if the suggestion was naive, and he was about to explain why. The human finished his drink and set the glass down with the same careful precision he had shown all evening, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed atmosphere of the bar. His eyes moved around the circle of alien faces, and something in his expression suggested that the most disturbing revelations were still to come. The question that Namsik had asked hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and Daehyun seemed to consider it carefully before responding. The human looked around at all the alien faces surrounding him, and his expression was almost sad, as if he regretted having to destroy their hopes for some kind of reasonable explanation. The beings gathered around the bar waited for his answer with the kind of desperate attention that people showed when they were hoping for good news but expecting the worst. Dong-wook had pushed his way through the crowd and now stood directly in front of the human with his blue skin showing patches of pale anxiety. The Kalari trader who had started the evening so confident and full of stories about his people's military prowess was now looking at Dae-hyun as if the human were some kind of dangerous animal that might attack without warning. His voice shook slightly as he asked whether humanity had surely learned from their violent past and evolved beyond such destructive tendencies when they finally reached the stars. The question seemed to echo what every being in the bar was thinking, because they all leaned forward slightly, as if the answer might provide some relief from the growing horror of what they had been hearing. Their faces showed a mixture of hope and fear as they waited for Dae-hyun to tell them that humans had outgrown their capacity for violence and had become peaceful members of the galactic community. The silence stretched out until it became almost unbearable. Dae-hyun stood up slowly, and his movement was deliberate and careful, as if he were aware that every eye in the bar was watching him. His plain jumpsuit and weathered face made him look completely ordinary, but somehow the beings around him had begun to step back without realizing they were doing it. The human finished the last of his drink and set the empty glass on the bar with a soft click that sounded loud in the absolute quiet. The cargo pilot looked around the circle of alien faces one more time, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been all evening, but somehow every word carried clearly to the furthest corners of the room. He told them that there was something they needed to understand about everything he had described, and his tone suggested that this final piece of information would be the most important thing they heard all night. Dae-hyun explained that all the wars he had mentioned and all the weapons he had described and all the death and destruction that had shocked them so badly had one thing in common that made them different from the conflicts that other species fought. His words came slowly, as if he were trying to be very careful about how he said what came next, because he knew it would be difficult for them to understand. The human told them that every battle and every weapon and every act of violence he had described had been committed by humans against other humans. He said it simply and without emphasis, as if he were stating an obvious fact that should have been clear all along. The silence that followed his words was so complete that the background hum of the station's life support systems seemed as loud as thunder. Dae-hyun went on to explain that his species had never actually fought a war against an alien race because they had never encountered one until they reached space. He described how all the massive conflicts and the centuries of warfare and the weapons capable of destroying planets had been used against members of their own species who lived on the same world and breathed the same air and shared the same basic biology. His voice remained calm and factual as he delivered this information. The beings around him began to make sounds that indicated various forms of psychological distress as they tried to process the implications of what they were hearing. The concept of intraspecies warfare on such a scale was so alien to most galactic civilizations that their minds struggled to accept it as possible. Most species fought other species for resources or territory, but the idea of turning such destructive power against their own kind was nearly incomprehensible. Dae-hyun continued his explanation by describing how humans had fought their wars over resources that could have been shared, and territories that could have been divided, and ideologies that could have been compromised. He mentioned that they had killed millions of their own kind over differences in religion that worshipped essentially the same concepts and political systems that wanted mostly the same things. The casual way he described this made it even more disturbing. Il-sung spoke for her entire collective when she asked in a voice that carried the confusion of millions of minds whether the human was saying that his species waged war against itself. The Kalaktari drone's question seemed to sum up what every being in the bar was thinking because the idea violated their basic understanding of how intelligent life was supposed to behave. The concept of self-destructive warfare was so foreign to most species that they had no framework for understanding it. Dae-hyun confirmed that humans did indeed fight constantly among themselves, and mentioned that even as he sat in the bar there were probably 15 or 20 armed conflicts happening on Earth at that very moment. He explained that these were smaller wars than the ones he had described earlier, but that his species had simply gotten better at keeping the big ones from starting, rather than learning to avoid violence altogether. The human moved toward the exit but paused before reaching the door as if he had remembered something important that he needed to add. He turned back to face the crowd of aliens who were still staring at him with expressions of shock and disbelief, and his face showed what might have been regret or might have been something darker. The beings in the bar waited for his final words, with the kind of attention that people paid to prophets or madmen. Dae-hyun mentioned almost as an afterthought that humans still possessed their nuclear weapons and were maintaining them in case they decided they needed to end their world someday. He said this in the same conversational tone he had used all evening, as if it were just an interesting bit of trivia rather than a statement that revealed the depth of his species' capacity for self-destruction. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The door of the bar hissed shut behind the human and left dozens of beings from across the galaxy standing in stunned silence as they tried to process what they had just learned. The atmosphere in the gravitational pull had changed completely from the friendly competition of earlier in the evening to something approaching terror as the aliens began to understand what humanity represented in the context of galactic civilization. Ara flickered with colors that indicated deep confusion as her energy form struggled to reconcile the human's ordinary appearance with the horrifying information he had shared. The Luxari being's voice was barely above a whisper as she commented that the humans had seemed so peaceful and normal when they first made contact with the galactic community. Her words carried the weight of a fundamental assumption that had been proven completely wrong. Kang Ho was trembling with all 6 arms as the full implications of what he had heard began to sink into his warrior's mind. The Vraxi fighter, who had been so proud of his people's reputation for violence, was now looking around the bar with new understanding as he realized that the most dangerous species in the galaxy had been sitting quietly among them all along. His voice was barely controlled as he spoke about the terrible irony of a race that could destroy itself, but chose not to. The camera pulled back through the transparent aluminum windows of the bar and showed the vast star field beyond where ships from 100 worlds came and went in their eternal dance of commerce and diplomacy. But inside the gravitational pull, the beings who had gathered to share stories of war and glory were now faced with the knowledge that somewhere among the stars was a species so dangerous that they made every other military force in the galaxy look like children playing with toys, and the most terrifying thing about them was that they did not even seem to realize it.